now, or a year from now. Formulation and evaluation of logical arguments. Let's look at good and bad arguments. A good argument shows that its conclusion is worthy of belief or acceptance. A bad argument fails to show this. A good argument gives you good reasons to accept a claim. A bad argument proves nothing. So how can you tell the difference between a good argument and a bad argument? So two basic types of arguments, categories I mentioned ago. One is deductive, and the other is inductive. So deductive, deductive arguments give logical, conclusive support to their conclusion. In other words, a deductive argument is structured in such a way and contains the components by which, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. It's stated that way. Inductively, however, these types of arguments offer only probabilistic support. That is to say that the premises relate to the conclusion in that what might probably or most likely be true, either by a preponderance of the evidence, because we've got this big pile of evidence over here. Well, that leads me to believe that it's more likely to be true than not, or so on, something like that. Two types of deductive arguments. One is valid, one is invalid, right? So consider the following classic deductive argument. All men are, it's a syllogism, major premise, minor premise, and conclusion. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. It's deductive because the support offered for the conclusion is meant to be absolutely unshakable. Not Socrates is probably something, So when a deductive argument actually achieves this kind of support, we say, well, that's valid. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must absolutely be true. But it's not the case in an invalid argument that if the premises are true, that the conclusion must be true. I mean, what if we took the same argument and we said, well, all ducks are mortal and Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates, or Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? I mean, they wouldn't make sense. It'd be totally invalid. You'd have to say, wait a minute, all ducks are mortal, Socrates is a duck, therefore Socrates, and then it doesn't even make sense. No matter how you change it. Why? Because it's an invalid argument. Let's talk about form or content here. Notice that the validity or invalidity of an argument is a matter of form, not its content. So the structure of a deductive argument renders it either valid or invalid, and validity is a separate matter from the truth of the argument's statements. It's statements, that is, the premises that lead to a conclusion, maybe either true or false, but that's nothing to do with its validity. In other words, you could have a perfectly valid argument because of its structure. So the validity goes to its structure, not to its content. Let's talk about inductive argumentation for just a moment. So much for deductive. So here's an example of an inductive argument. Almost all men at this college have high SAT scores. Therefore, Julio, a student at the college, probably has high SAT scores. So this argument is inductive because it's intended to provide probable but not decisive support to the conclusion. That is, the argument is intended to show only that at best the conclusion is probably true. And with any inductive argument, it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. So we ask then, is the argument, the inductive argument, strong or weak? So we don't ask this of deductive arguments, but we ask this of inductive when the conclusion is probably, it leans me, tips the scales to some degree one way or the other. So we say that argument is either strong or weak. So it's strong if the premises are true, the conclusion is probably true, that is more likely than not. So there's some things, for example, the existence of God, we would say we know this deductively, absolutely true, but we don't want to suggest somehow that this is subject to an inductive kind of argument. Well, probably, maybe, more likely than not, something like that. And that's not preference. That's based on what we believe the evidence is, that we have solid, absolute, deductive reasons, evidence to support the conclusion. So review of the argument composition then, or wait a minute, let me go to the weak first. Weak, if the premises are true, the conclusion is not probable. That is more likely not to be true. That would be weak. You've presented an argument, but you really haven't advanced the ball very far. There's not enough to support it. So just a review then, good arguments provide you with good reasons for believing their conclusions. Good arguments must be valid or strong. Good arguments must also have true premises. Good arguments must both have the right form, be valid or strong, and have reliable content, have true premises. I mean, that's awful fast, but those four things are huge and can really revolutionize how you consume information in this information-rich age when you're being bombarded by a million websites and social media and everything else, when all you're hearing are claims. How do you filter all of that? And you're going to have to learn a process of critical thinking that says that's either this person is saying they know something absolutely, or they know probabilistically, yes, for sure, 100%. I'm not really sure, but this way. And then, what are your reasons? And do your reasons align with your evidence such that you really need to review that evidence? So any argument that fails in either of these respects is a bad argument. And you have to be able to say, it's just a bad argument. I was recently on and this is what I do sometimes during lunch. I want to say for fun, but it's really not fun, as I go on the atheistic websites, and these are, I'll give you one, like the Atheist Experience, right? And this has been on for 20 years probably. Matt Dillahunty, and he has different people on. So I will comment, they're nice comments, but fair comments, but there was an analogy that was proposed that I just said, well, that analogy just doesn't fit with any of this. And I wrote in the comment, I said, well, it's an interesting analogy, but it doesn't prove anything. It's not appropriate for this particular conclusion that's being drawn. And what I ended up getting, as you can imagine, a response to the comment was purely ad hominem. That is, instead of sort of returning fire by saying, well, I'd like to suggest these following reasons as to why I think that was a good analogy. Instead, it was all of these personal sort of attacks against my character, which I have, I said, really? How does that prove anything? And so it was basically that the person giving the analogy was of such wonderful character that how could you not accept what they're saying? And my comment was, I don't see that as a valid measure of truth. Valid measure, it doesn't mean if somebody has good character that out of their mouth everything they say is true. We need evidence. And so you get the picture of all this. So a valid argument with true premises is said to be sound. A strong argument with true premises is said to be cogent. Sound in that it's competent, it's sensible, it's valid. Cogent in that it's relevant, compelling, and appealing forcibly to the mind. So evaluating deductive arguments. Well, a valid deductive argument then indicates the arguments formed by using a kind of standard shorthand. If then therefore, something like that. If Maria walks to work, then she will be late. She's walking to work, therefore she will be late. Well, we symbolize that with this if P, then Q. That's just how it works in philosophical arguments and how we use notation, standard notation in this form. If P, then Q. Or in other words, to say, then it follows. It follows. And you'll hear people talk this way. Well, if this, then this, meaning if this is true, then it follows. If Maria walks to work, if that's true that she walks to work, then she will be late. And you know this because, the distance is too far and the time she sets out and so on and so forth, things like that. So the first premise, a compound statement consisting of two constituent statements, P and Q. If P, then Q. When you see that indicator word if, you're thinking, well, it's conditioned on something. If Maria drives to work, then she's not going to be late. But if she walks to work, she will be late. That's a condition, So there's at least one conditional premise. And you don't have to go into detail on that because you'll see it. And if someone is writing it and it's embedded in a paragraph in non-argumentative prose, which we just said, then you'll watch for the statement. Well, if this, then this, something like that. And they're making a conditional argument. And so you'd say, well, are the conditions prevailing then? Is that a true statement about the conditions? And if so, then does it follow? Just because somebody says it follows, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Does it really follow that that's the case? So the first premise, if Maria walks to work, she'll be late. The second premise affirms the antecedent. It affirms the antecedent. And so we'll see this in a moment, I hope, the antecedent and the consequent, If Maria walks to work, that's the antecedent. The consequent, the second part, then, consequentially, the second part. If this, then the consequence. Consequent. If the antecedent, Maria walks to work, then she will be late. So we call this affirming the antecedent. And this form is always valid all the time when something is placed in this particular form. Invalid deductive arguments then. Let's give an example using the same person, right? If Maria walks to work, then she will be late. Second, she will not walk to work. Well, therefore she will not be late. Let's just do it this way. Well, if Maria walks to work, then she will be late. She will not walk to work, therefore she won't be late. But there's problems. You can see why that's invalid. It may not be apparent to you right now. But we could ask, because you didn't say she's driving a car, but you're saying, how else could she possibly get to work? How else? So if P, then Q in this particular construct, it does not follow then. So even a false statement or a false antecedent, if Maria will not walk to work, doesn't mean that she will not be late. Maybe she'll sit at home and be late or be late for some other reason. But when the antecedent is denied, the premises can be true and the conclusion false. It's a little hard to take this all in, but I'm just saying that you have to begin thinking critically, what are the other possibilities? Like once you have a conditional argument, what other conditions might exist other than those stated that could influence the conclusion, do you see? Just because somebody's saying, well, if these conditions prevail, then this is what's going to happen. And if another set of conditions prevail, the same thing happens? Well, we don't know that, right? So we don't know it until it's tested, and it's invalid to conclude that based on just varying the conditions. Same conclusion, but varying the conditions. Another form of valid argumentation would be a hypothetical syllogism. A hypothetical means conditional. A syllogism is a three-step statement. If Maria walks to work, then she'll be late. If she's late, she will be fired. So just adding an additional conditional statement, therefore if she walks to work, she'll be fired. How does this work out in terms of the hypothetical or the conditional argument? If the premises are true, the conclusion is true. So you are, in this particular point, using this simple syllogism: if P, then Q. If Q, then R, being changing one particular variable. Therefore, if P, then R, it does follow. It's in a proper form, and it follows. So the best way to use these facts is to memorize each argument form, so you can tell right away when an argument matches one of them, and thereby see immediately that it's valid or invalid. But what if you bump up a deductive argument that does not match one of these forms? So that's like using a counter example method. So you could try a counter example, and this approach is based on a fundamental fact that you already know. Like, it's impossible for a valid argument to have true premises and a false conclusion. So you test the validity of an argument by inventing a twin argument that is exactly the same form as the argument you are examining, but you try to give this argument, this new argument, true premises and a false conclusion. So if you construct such an argument, you have proven that your original argument is invalid. So a counter example: if capital punishment deters crime, then the number of death row inmates will decrease over time. Therefore, the number of death row inmates will not decrease over time. Here's the example. So what's missing in between is you want to add some elements to this. For example, but capital punishment does not deter over time. Does anything else deter crime? Perhaps law enforcement has decreased drug traffic, a primary cause of violent crime. You can probably see right away that this argument is an example of denying the antecedent, which is an invalid form for an argument. So if capital punishment deters crime, then the number of death row inmates will decrease over time. Therefore, the number of death row inmates will not decrease over time. How do you account for that? In other words, I'm doing this indelicately, I know, but by using a counter example, you want to begin asking some questions like, what else would deter crime? What else? So as to falsify the conclusion that's drawn in a counter example. Right. So anyway, I can see we're eating up a lot of time with this, so I'm going to try to move along a little bit faster. What about implied premises? What's implied? And most of the arguments that we encounter every day in everyday life are embedded in larger tracts of non-argumentative prose, as we stated earlier. And so some premises may be implied or even unstated. This problem is especially common in moral arguments, where the implicit premises are frequently the most controversial and in most need of close scrutiny. So sometimes the premises are implicit because they are too obvious to mention. Readers mentally then fill in the blanks. But in most cases, implicit premises should not be left unstated. So it's often unclear what premises have been assumed, and unless these are spelled out, argument evaluation becomes difficult or impossible. So what's an example of an unstated premise? So here, hopefully this doesn't offend anybody, but the one in the book refers to birth control, for example, or the author could say the use of birth control is completely unnatural. So birth control devices have been manufactured for the explicit purpose of interfering in the natural process of procreation. Therefore, the use of birth control should be banned. So the author states, let's say. So in this argument, the first two sentences constitute really a single premise, the gist of which is that using birth control is unnatural, and the conclusion is that the use of birth control should be banned. But this conclusion, however, does not follow from the stated premise. There's a logical gap between the premise and the conclusion. And the argument will only work if the missing premise is supplied. So here's a good possibility. Anything that interferes in a natural process should not be allowed. I'm just trying to say, how can we enhance the argument to make it valid? So then the argument becomes the use of birth control is completely unnatural. Birth control devices have been manufactured for the explicit purpose of interfering in the natural process of procreation. Anything that interferes in the natural process of such as procreation should not be allowed. Therefore, the use of birth control should be banned. And so this is a moral argument because it indicates some type of value being attached to something. I mean, the nature of the argument being what it purports is a value or not a value. We're just looking at the form of that argument at this point. In other words, and I've done this many times in secular classrooms, a whole range of moral issues, to create valid arguments for a position that I don't agree with, because just because it's valid or it's in a valid form doesn't mean that it's true. But once you put it in a valid point, then you can point out the weaknesses of the evidence that support the reasons that are behind the statements or the premises that are made, thus rendering the conclusion false. So I'm going to ratchet ahead simply because I feel for the sake of time we're severely out of that. There's just so much here and so much ground to cover. But I wanted to talk about logical fallacies just for a moment, and the last couple of slides have to do with this. And it's worth, and we can't spend a lot of time here, but